Every morning, John, the garbage man, followed the same route. He had been doing this job for years and knew every house by heart. Most days were the same. He would pick up the bins, throw the trash in his truck, and move on. But today was different. As he approached Mr. Harrison's house, something caught his eye. It was a small wooden bin placed at the curb, looking out of place. Normally, Mr. Harrison had his usual trash. But today, something felt off. John stopped his truck, pulled the brake, and stepped out. The old house stood quiet, the garden overgrown with weeds. Mr. Harrison, an elderly man who lived alone, was nowhere to be seen. John had known him for years. He'd always been a bit of a loner, quiet and reserved. But John had always been polite, nodding to him as he picked up his trash. There had never been anything unusual about the house until now. As John walked closer, he noticed the contents of the bin. At first glance, it seemed like normal garbage: papers, a few plastic bottles, and broken items. But something else caught his attention. There, at the bottom of the bin, was a torn-up jacket. It looked old and worn, as if it had been hidden there for a long time. John bent down to take a closer look. The jacket didn't seem like something someone would throw away so carelessly. It looked like it held some kind of story, something personal. He carefully reached into the bin and moved the jacket aside. Underneath it was a small box, almost buried beneath the trash. The box looked out of place. It wasn't like the other items in the bin. It had a wooden finish and seemed old, like it had been kept for years. The edges were chipped, and the lid was slightly ajar. John felt a strange feeling wash over him. His curiosity got the better of him, and he picked up the box carefully. As he held it in his hands, he could feel the weight of it, like there was something important inside. The box rattled slightly, as if it contained something inside that could be heard. John glanced around, feeling a bit uneasy. The street was empty, and Mr. Harrison's house was silent. He didn't know why, but he felt like something wasn't right. John hesitated for a moment before opening the box. Inside, he found a few old photographs, yellowed with age, and a small letter. The photographs showed a younger Mr. Harrison with a woman, standing in front of a house that didn't look like his current home. The woman was smiling, her arm around Mr. Harrison's waist. The photo looked like a memory from a long time ago, from a life that John didn't know about. John's heart began to race. What was this? Why would Mr. Harrison throw these personal items away? He flipped through the photographs, trying to make sense of them. There were no names written on the back, just the images of a happy couple. But one thing stood out. The woman in the photos looked familiar to him. It was a strange feeling, as if he had seen her somewhere before. The letter, however, caught his attention the most. It was written in faded ink, and the edges were curled. John carefully unfolded it, trying to read the small handwriting. The letter was addressed to someone named Elizabeth, but the rest of the words were hard to make out. He could only catch a few words, something about a promise and a warning. John's hands trembled slightly as he put the letter back in the box. The more he looked at it, the more he realized that this wasn't just some forgotten memory. The box, the letter, and the photographs seemed to tell a story that Mr. Harrison had hidden away. Why would he throw something like this out with the trash? Was Mr. Harrison hiding something from his past? John couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something important. John stood there, holding the box, his mind racing with questions. He felt a mix of curiosity and unease. What was the significance of these items? Why was Mr. Harrison throwing them away? Was there something dangerous about them? John knew that he couldn't just ignore what he had found. He had to know more. But what should he do with the box? Should he give it back to Mr. Harrison, or should he investigate further? John looked around again, making sure no one was watching. He couldn't explain why, but he felt like he was being drawn into something bigger than just an old man's forgotten trash. Before he could decide what to do, a cold shiver ran down his spine. Something told him that this was just the beginning. What he had found today could change everything. You said. John continued his route, but the discovery kept weighing on his mind. As he drove his truck down the street, he couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Harrison's bin. He glanced at the box in the passenger seat, still wrapped in the torn-up jacket. There was something about it that felt so personal, like it wasn't meant to be found by anyone else. Yet here he was, holding onto this secret. His usual routine of picking up trash and moving on suddenly felt empty. He knew Mr. Harrison was a quiet man, always polite but distant. He had lived alone for as long as John could remember. His house was always in a state of disrepair, and John had assumed it was because the old man didn't care much about appearances. But this was different. The box, the photographs, the letter. It felt like a part of Mr. Harrison's past that he had tried to bury, something he didn't want anyone to see. John's thoughts swirled in his head, each new question adding to the growing mystery. Who was Elizabeth? Why did Mr. Harrison keep these photographs? And that letter? Why had he thrown them away? These were not things you simply toss in the trash. John had seen enough discarded items to know that some things are too precious to just throw away. Yet Mr. Harrison had done it, and that left John uneasy. He looked down at the box again. He couldn't just keep it. There was no telling what might be inside that could shed light on what he had found. John wasn't sure if he was ready to face whatever mystery lay in that box, but he knew he had to find out more. He had to know why Mr. Harrison had hidden this part of his life in the garbage. As John drove, he thought about the best way to approach Mr. Harrison. Should he just return the box and pretend he had never seen it, or should he ask him about it? He had to be careful. Mr. Harrison wasn't someone who opened up easily, and John wasn't sure how he would react if he knew someone had found his hidden memories. But before he could decide, he heard a loud screech from the tires of his truck. He quickly slammed on the brakes, snapping back to the present moment. The truck came to a sudden halt, and John's heart raced. He had driven right past Mr. Harrison's house without even realizing it. He had been so lost in thought that he hadn't even noticed the street signs. He took a deep breath and turned the truck around, heading back to the house. When he arrived, the house seemed as quiet and still as ever. The garden looked unkempt, the front door closed tightly, and there was no sign of Mr. Harrison. John sat in the truck for a moment, staring at the house. Should he go in? What if Mr. Harrison wasn't even home? He didn't want to intrude, but something inside him urged him to find out the truth. John stepped out of the truck and walked up the narrow path to the front door. He knocked softly, but there was no answer. He knocked again, this time a little louder. Still, nothing. John stood there for a few moments, unsure of what to do. He could feel the weight of the box in his hand, the mystery still haunting him. Finally, he decided to leave it for now. He would try again later. But just as he turned to walk back to the truck, the front door creaked open. Mr. Harrison stood in the doorway, looking at John with a blank expression. His face seemed tired, worn from years of silence, but there was something else there too, something in his eyes that John couldn't quite place. "Can I help you?" Mr. Harrison asked, his voice raspy and soft. John's heart skipped a beat. He held the box up, unsure of how to start. "I found something in your bin," he said, trying to sound casual. "I think it's yours." Mr. Harrison's eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment, he looked like he might step back inside and shut the door. But he didn't. Instead, he stared at the box in John's hands, his face going pale. John didn't know what to say next. The silence between them stretched on, thick with tension. Finally, Mr. Harrison sighed deeply. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. John hesitated. "It's a box. Old photographs. A letter. It looks like something you didn't want anyone to see." Mr. Harrison's face grew even paler, and his hands shook slightly. He looked down at the ground, as if trying to gather his thoughts. After a long pause, he spoke again, this time with a hint of sadness in his voice. "I didn't mean for anyone to find that. he said, his voice trailing off. John didn't know how to respond. He had so many questions, but now that he was standing face to face with Mr. Harrison, it didn't feel right to press him too hard. Instead, he decided to leave the box with him, hoping it would open the door to the truth. "I'll leave it here, then," John said, stepping forward and placing the box on the doorstep. "But you should know, it's not just trash." With that, John turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Mr. Harrison standing in the doorway, holding the secrets of his past in his hands. As John drove away, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real story was just beginning. The next day, as John drove his usual route, his thoughts were still consumed by the previous day's events. The image of Mr. Harrison standing at the door, holding the box, was etched in his mind. The old man hadn't said much, but his face had said it all. It was as if he was carrying the weight of a long-hidden secret, and for the first time, John felt that he was only beginning to understand the layers of mystery surrounding the old man's life. John couldn't help but wonder about the letter and the photographs. Who was Elizabeth? What had happened to her? Why had Mr. Harrison hidden all of it away? His curiosity continued to grow. He had never been one to pry into other people's lives. But this felt different. Something deep inside told him that he needed to know more. The discovery of the box wasn't just an accident. It felt like a sign, like he was meant to uncover whatever Mr. Harrison had been hiding. As John approached Mr. Harrison's house again, he noticed that the house looked exactly the same as it always did, silent, unchanged. He could see the curtains drawn inside, and there was no sign of movement, but something in his gut told him that today might be different. John had to know if Mr. Harrison was going to open up about what he had found in the trash. John parked his truck a little further down the road this time, hoping not to draw attention. He walked up to the house, his footsteps heavy with anticipation. He knocked on the door, but this time, it wasn't just the casual knock of a garbage man doing his job. It was the knock of someone who was searching for answers, someone who couldn't let go of the mystery he had uncovered. The door creaked open slowly, and Mr. Harrison appeared again, this time looking even more tired than the day before. His eyes were bloodshot, as though he hadn't slept at all. He looked at John, his gaze wary, but he didn't try to close the door this time. Instead, he stepped back, gesturing for John to come inside. "Come in," Mr. Harrison said quietly, his voice softer than before. "I think it's time I tell you." John hesitated for a moment. This wasn't just a casual visit. He wasn't just there to pick up trash or drop off a box. Something was happening. He stepped inside. The interior of the house was dim, with the smell of old wood and dust in the air. The furniture was worn and mismatched, as though it had all been collected over many years. The walls were lined with photographs, some in frames, others tucked away in piles on shelves. It was clear that Mr. Harrison hadn't thrown everything away, only the things that seemed too painful to keep. "Sit down," Mr. Harrison said, his voice breaking the silence. He gestured to a worn-out armchair near the fireplace. John sat down, his heart pounding. He had no idea what was about to unfold, but he felt like he was about to learn something that would change everything. Mr. Harrison took a seat across from him, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at the floor, as though gathering his thoughts. Then he looked up at John, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and sorrow. "I suppose I owe you an explanation," Mr. Harrison began. "You found something in my trash, something that I thought no one would ever see. But now that you've found it, I can't hide it anymore. I've spent years trying to forget, trying to bury the past, but it seems like the past has a way of finding its way back to us." John sat quietly, not knowing what to say. He wanted to ask so many questions, but he could see that Mr. Harrison was struggling to find the right words, so he waited. "It was a long time ago," Mr. Harrison continued. "Elizabeth, she was my wife. We were happy once. But then things changed. There were things in my past that I couldn't escape, things I should have told her about. But I didn't. I kept them hidden, thinking it was for the best. But it wasn't. And when she found out, it all fell apart. John listened closely, his mind racing. Elizabeth. She wasn't just a name in the photographs. She was the key to understanding what had happened to Mr. Harrison. She found out about my past, Mr. Harrison said, his voice shaking. About a man I used to know, someone I had done business with, a man who was dangerous. Elizabeth found a letter, a warning from someone who knew the truth about him. I was supposed to protect her, but I didn't. I couldn't. And she never forgave me. After that, everything fell apart. Elizabeth died a few years later, and I've lived with that guilt ever since. John could see the pain in Mr. Harrison's eyes as he spoke. The old man had carried this burden alone for so many years, hiding it away in the box, in the trash, hoping no one would find it. But John had. And now Mr. Harrison was finally letting go of the secret that had haunted him for decades. I threw everything away because I didn't want to remember, Mr. Harrison whispered. I thought if I could forget, maybe the guilt would go away. But it never does. John sat there in silence, letting Mr. Harrison's words sink in. The story was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just a box of old memories. It was a story of love, guilt, and a past that refused to stay buried. John didn't know what to say. He felt a deep sympathy for Mr. Harrison, but he also knew that this story wasn't over yet. There was still something about the warning letter, about the dangerous man from Mr. Harrison's past, that didn't sit right with him. But for now, all he could do was listen, knowing that the truth was slowly coming to light, piece by piece. The following morning, John couldn't shake the thoughts of what Mr. Harrison had revealed. The story he had shared was enough to leave anyone unsettled, but there was still a lingering feeling that something was not fully understood. The mention of the dangerous man, the letter, and the warning. It all weighed heavily on John's mind. What had Mr. Harrison been involved in all those years ago? Why had he kept such a dark secret for so long? John couldn't forget the look in Mr. Harrison's eyes when he spoke about Elizabeth's death. There was a sense of unresolved guilt there, something that had been eating away at him for decades. It was clear that Mr. Harrison had tried to protect her, but whatever had happened between them had changed the course of both their lives. John felt sympathy for the old man, but at the same time, his curiosity grew even stronger. He needed to know the whole truth. There were still too many unanswered questions. That evening, after finishing his route, John found himself standing in front of Mr. Harrison's house again. The decision had been made. He couldn't let things end here. There was still more to uncover, and he had a feeling that Mr. Harrison wasn't sharing everything. He had to ask about the dangerous man, the one who had been connected to Mr. Harrison's past. Maybe there was something in that warning letter that would help him understand what had truly happened. John knocked at the door, feeling a sense of urgency in his chest. He didn't know what he expected, but he hoped that Mr. Harrison would be willing to open up just a little more. The door opened slowly, and Mr. Harrison appeared, looking tired but not surprised to see John standing there. "John," he said softly, his eyes weary. "What brings you back here?" "I need to know more," John replied, his voice steady but serious. "About the man you mentioned, the one from your past. I think there's something more you haven't told me." Mr. Harrison's face tightened, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes flickered with hesitation, and it seemed as though he was struggling with whether to say more. Finally, he stepped aside and motioned for John to come in. "Come inside," he said, his voice quiet. "I guess it's time I told you the whole story." John stepped into the dimly lit house, the smell of old wood and dust lingering in the air. The interior was as he remembered, cluttered with old furniture and framed photographs. But today, it felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, as though the walls themselves were holding onto memories, just like Mr. Harrison had been holding onto his past. The two of them sat in silence for a few moments before Mr. Harrison spoke again. "I didn't want to drag anyone into it," he began, his voice low. "But I know you deserve to know. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was something bigger, something dangerous. The man I was involved with, his name was Frank Miller. He wasn't just a business associate. He was a criminal. I didn't realize how deep he was into illegal activities until it was too late. John listened closely, trying to process what he was hearing. Frank Miller, a name John had never heard before, was the key to the puzzle. But how did this all tie into the letter, and why had Mr. Harrison kept it hidden for so long? I was young, foolish, Mr. Harrison continued. I thought I could get out, that I could distance myself from him. But Frank wasn't the type of man who let people walk away. Elizabeth, she found out the truth. She found the letter, the warning that Frank was coming for me. And I didn't take it seriously. I should have, but I didn't. By the time I realized the danger we were in, it was too late. John's heart pounded as he began to understand the weight of the situation. Mr. Harrison had been involved with a dangerous man, and Elizabeth had discovered the threat too late. The warning letter, was it a cry for help from someone who knew what was going to happen? John felt a mix of sadness and anger for the young couple. How could someone like Frank Miller have had so much power over their lives? Elizabeth tried to protect me, Mr. Harrison whispered, his voice filled with regret. But Frank wasn't someone you could protect yourself from. He threatened us both, and when I couldn't stop him, Elizabeth took matters into her own hands. She tried to warn others, but she never got the chance. The night she died, she was on her way to tell the police. She was going to expose everything. But Frank got to her first. John sat there, stunned. The story was worse than he had imagined. Elizabeth's death had been no accident. It was a result of Frank Miller's actions, and Mr. Harrison had been caught in the middle of it all, unable to save her. After that, Mr. Harrison continued, his voice shaking with emotion. I couldn't bear the guilt. I didn't know what to do. I tried to forget everything, move on, but it never left me. It was too much. And when I saw the box, when I found the photographs and the letter, I realized I had to let go. I couldn't keep hiding the past, not anymore. John felt a deep sorrow for Mr. Harrison. The old man's life had been shattered by his past, and it was clear that he had never truly healed. But as the story unfolded, something in John's gut told him that the danger wasn't over yet. Frank Miller's shadow was still looming, and there was no telling how far his influence stretched. The letter was a warning, but the threat had never truly gone away. Mr. Harrison, John said quietly, I think you need to contact the authorities. The past can't stay buried forever. Frank Miller is still a threat. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resignation. I know, he whispered, but I don't know where to start. The years have passed, and I'm just an old man now. What if it's too late? It's never too late, John said firmly. You don't have to face this alone anymore. With that, they both sat in silence, knowing that the truth was out, but the journey to justice was just beginning. Days passed, and John couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Harrison had shared with him. The more he thought about it, the more he felt a sense of urgency. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but there were still too many unanswered questions. If Frank Miller was still out there, if the danger had never truly gone away, then Mr. Harrison wasn't the only one at risk. John had to make sure that something was done before it was too late. John had tried to persuade Mr. Harrison to go to the authorities, to tell them everything he had shared with him. But the old man remained hesitant. He seemed afraid of what might happen if he brought the past to light. His guilt, his fear, it all held him back. John understood, but he also knew that the longer they waited, the greater the danger would become. Frank Miller had already destroyed so much in Mr. Harrison's life, and now he was poised to do it again. One evening, as John was finishing his route, he found himself standing in front of Mr. Harrison's house once more. He had come to a decision. He couldn't wait for Mr. Harrison to act. If the old man wouldn't speak out, John would have to take matters into his own hands. He had no idea where to start, but he knew that Frank Miller was still out there, and that the truth needed to come to light. John knocked on Mr. Harrison's door again, this time more determined than ever. When the door opened, Mr. Harrison stood there, looking even more frail than before. His eyes were tired, and his shoulders slumped as if the weight of the past had become too much to carry. "I know you're scared," John said softly, "but we can't let this go on any longer. Frank Miller is still out there, and I'm not going to let him hurt anyone else. You have to help me stop him." Mr. Harrison sighed, his face filled with resignation. "I can't," he whispered. "I've tried to forget everything. I've spent so many years trying to bury it all. But Frank, he's dangerous. He won't stop. I don't know how to stop him." John stepped forward, his voice steady. "You don't have to do this alone. I'll help you. We can find a way to make sure he never hurts anyone again." Mr. Harrison stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the decision. Finally, he nodded, though it was clear that he was still unsure. "I don't know if it's possible," he said softly, "but I'm not going to live in fear anymore." John smiled gently. "We'll figure it out together." The two of them sat down, and Mr. Harrison began to tell John more about Frank Miller's connections, the people he had worked with, the places he frequented. For the first time, it seemed like Mr. Harrison was ready to confront his past. He shared everything he knew, his voice trembling but growing more determined with each word. It was clear that the years of keeping the secret had taken their toll on him, but now he was finally ready to fight back. "I remember where he used to hang out," Mr. Harrison said, his eyes narrowing as he recalled the past. "There was a place he would go, an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was always dark, always quiet. That's where he did his business. If he's still around, he's probably still there." John listened carefully, committing every detail to memory. "We need to get in touch with someone who can help us, someone who can track down Frank. The police need to know everything." Mr. Harrison nodded reluctantly. "I can't do it, but I'll tell you everything I know. I just hope it's not too late." After a long conversation, John promised Mr. Harrison that he wouldn't give up. He wasn't going to let the old man face this alone anymore. John knew that they were both taking a risk, but they had no choice. Frank Miller had to be stopped before he caused any more damage. The next morning, John made a call to a contact he knew, someone in law enforcement who could help them track down Frank Miller. It was a long shot, but it was the only option they had. He explained the situation, and while the officer on the other end of the line was skeptical, John insisted that they had to take action. He couldn't let the past continue to haunt Mr. Harrison, and he couldn't let Frank Miller walk free. The officer agreed to meet with John, and together they began to piece together a plan. They would have to be careful, but they were determined to find Frank Miller and bring him to justice. It wasn't going to be easy, but John knew that they had to act quickly before Frank could strike again. That evening, as the sun set, John stood in front of Mr. Harrison's house one last time. He had a plan in motion now, and he was going to make sure that Frank Miller's reign of terror ended once and for all. The old man wasn't alone anymore. John had promised that they would face this together, and now it was time to follow through. As he knocked on the door, John's heart raced. He was on the verge of something big, something that could change everything for Mr. Harrison. But there was still so much unknown. Frank Miller was out there, and the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. The story wasn't over yet, and John wasn't about to stop until the past had been brought into the light, no matter what it took. The plan was in motion, but John couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a dangerous line. As he prepared to meet with the officer to track down Frank Miller, he knew the risks involved. The old man's past was far from over, and it seemed that every step they took only led them deeper into the mystery. But John had made a promise to help Mr. Harrison, to make sure that Frank Miller's shadow didn't destroy any more lives. He couldn't back down now. That night, John stood outside Mr. Harrison's house once again. His truck was parked in front, and he had just finished speaking to the officer, who had agreed to meet him the following day to start searching for Miller. But even with the plan in place, John knew they were still in danger. There was always the possibility that Frank Miller had seen them coming, or worse, that he was already aware of their intentions. John knocked softly on the door, trying to remain calm despite the tension building in his chest. It had been a long, exhausting journey, and he had no idea what the next steps would bring. The old man had been through so much, but now, at least, they were taking action. The past had come back with a vengeance, and the only way out was to face it head-on. Mr. Harrison opened the door slowly, as though he was expecting John. His eyes were filled with concern, but there was something different about him now, a sense of resolve. For the first time, John could see that the old man wasn't hiding behind his guilt and fear anymore. He was ready to take the first step toward closure. "I've made arrangements," John said quietly, his voice low with determination. "The officer will help us track Frank Miller down. We'll be careful, but we can't wait any longer." Mr. Harrison nodded slowly, his face solemn. "I know," he said, his voice full of regret. "I don't know how much time we have, but we have to do something." John could sense the weight of Mr. Harrison's words. It wasn't just about stopping Frank Miller anymore. It was about making peace with the past, something that had haunted Mr. Harrison for so long. "We'll make sure he can't hurt anyone else," John assured him, trying to keep his voice steady. "I won't let it happen." The two of them sat down inside the house, the quiet hum of the old clock on the wall filling the silence between them. Mr. Harrison seemed lost in thought as he stared at the photos of Elizabeth on the mantelpiece. John knew that the pain of losing her still ran deep, but now they had a chance to make things right. "I never thought I'd see the day when I'd have to confront all of this again," Mr. Harrison said softly. "I thought I could bury it, forget it, but it's like the past won't let go. And now you're here, trying to help me fix what I've broken." "You're not alone anymore," John said gently, offering a small but reassuring smile. "We'll find a way to put this behind you." They sat in silence for a few more moments, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them. But for the first time, Mr. Harrison seemed to find some comfort in the fact that he wasn't facing it all alone. With John by his side, he no longer had to carry the burden of his past on his own. They were a team now. As John left that evening, he felt a mixture of hope and fear. The next few days would be crucial. Too much was at stake, and the danger they faced wasn't over yet. Frank Miller had been a shadow in Mr. Harrison's life for too long, and now it was time to bring that shadow into the light. But how far would Miller go to protect his secrets? What lengths would he take to ensure that the truth remained buried? John couldn't help but feel like they were on the edge of something far greater than they understood. Every decision from here on out would matter. He had to keep his focus on the goal, stopping Frank Miller and making sure Mr. Harrison's past didn't destroy any more lives. The following morning, John met with the officer, a man named Detective Blake, who had agreed to help. Blake had been skeptical at first, but after hearing the details from John, he'd become more willing to investigate. The officer had pulled some records on Frank Miller, and it seemed like he had a history, one that stretched far beyond anything Mr. Harrison had mentioned. "We need to be cautious," Detective Blake warned. "Miller is a dangerous man. If he's still out there, he's not going to go down without a fight." John nodded, his heart racing with the gravity of the situation. He couldn't let fear stop him now, not when they were so close to the truth. "I understand. But we can't wait. We have to stop him before he hurts anyone else." The detective agreed, and they set a plan in motion. John would gather the information Mr. Harrison had shared, while Detective Blake would track down any leads on Frank Miller's whereabouts. Together, they hoped to piece together the puzzle and put an end to the old man's nightmare. As the day wore on, John's mind kept drifting back to Mr. Harrison and the fear in his eyes. The man had carried his guilt and pain for so long, and now it seemed like they were nearing the end of the road. But there was still the lingering question: what was Frank Miller capable of? And if they managed to track him down, would it be enough to finally bring him to justice? John knew that whatever happened next, the truth would come to light, and Mr. Harrison's burden would be lifted. But only if they could stop the one person who had haunted his life for so long. The pieces were falling into place. The truth was within reach. But Frank Miller was still out there, and time was running out. As the days passed, John's determination grew stronger. He and Detective Blake had been following leads, tracking down information about Frank Miller, but they were running out of time. Every moment spent searching felt like they were getting closer to uncovering the truth, but also closer to the danger Miller still posed. John's thoughts kept returning to the same question. Could they really bring Miller to justice before it was too late? John spent countless hours going over the details Mr. Harrison had provided, the notes about the warehouse, the people Miller had worked with, and the dark corners of the town that Miller had frequented. It seemed like no matter how much they uncovered, there was always something more hidden beneath the surface. But John was relentless. The more he thought about it, the more he knew they couldn't give up now, not when they were so close to stopping this once and for all. Then, one evening, John received a phone call that would change everything. Detective Blake had found something, a lead that finally seemed to connect the dots. They had located Frank Miller's last known whereabouts, and it was at a property just outside town. It was an abandoned farmhouse, surrounded by overgrown fields. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make John's heart race. This was it. This could be their chance to finally end the nightmare. Without wasting any time, John made his way to the detective's office, where they went over the plan. The approach was simple. They would go in quietly, make sure to confirm Miller's presence, and then contact the authorities to handle the arrest. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a darkness that still hung in the air, a sense that Miller was always one step ahead of them. The longer they waited, the more dangerous it became. As John and Detective Blake drove to the farmhouse, the tension was palpable. The air felt thick, and the silence in the car was heavy. John's mind raced, wondering what they would find when they arrived. Was Miller still there? Had he been tipped off? Was this all part of Miller's plan to stay hidden? When they arrived, the farmhouse loomed before them, its windows boarded up, its paint peeling from years of neglect. It was eerily quiet, with no sign of life. But John knew better than to assume it was empty. Miller was cunning, and the past had shown that he always managed to slip through their fingers. The two of them approached cautiously, sticking to the shadows as they moved around the property. It was as if the whole place had been frozen in time, a reminder of the past that refused to let go. As they made their way toward the back of the house, John's heart began to race again. There was a faint sound, a low creak coming from inside, as if someone was moving. "Stay close," Blake whispered, his voice barely audible. "We don't know what we're dealing with." John nodded, his senses heightened as they crept closer to the back door. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and John could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They were getting closer to finding out whether Miller was still here. But with every step, the weight of the situation seemed to grow heavier. Finally, they reached the door. Detective Blake motioned for John to stay back as he gently tested the handle. It was unlocked. They had made it this far without alerting anyone. But now, the final decision had to be made. John's heart was in his throat. What would they find inside? Blake nodded, and together they entered the dark, musty interior of the farmhouse. The place was in shambles, with debris scattered across the floor and broken furniture lining the walls. But it was the smell, the stale, oppressive air, that sent a chill down John's spine. There was something wrong here. Something felt off. As they crept through the house, every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo in the silence. They moved quickly, checking each room, each corner. The tension was unbearable. And then, At the very back of the house, they found it. A small room, hidden behind a door that had been covered with boxes. Inside, the room was dimly lit, but there was something unmistakable about the sight before them. A stack of old papers, photographs, a familiar letter, one that John recognized immediately. It was the warning letter that Mr. Harrison had received all those years ago. The very letter that had been part of the dark past they were trying to uncover. It was clear now that Frank Miller had kept it hidden, just like everything else. John's pulse quickened as he stepped closer, his fingers trembling as he picked up the letter. There, scrawled in a jagged handwriting, were words that made his stomach drop. "You can't run from your past, Harrison. It's coming for you." The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. Frank Miller wasn't just a criminal. He had been playing a dangerous game, watching from the shadows, knowing that the past would catch up with everyone involved. The letter wasn't just a threat. It was a message, a warning to anyone who dared to get too close to the truth. "We need to get out of here," Blake said urgently, pulling John back from the papers. "This isn't safe. Miller could be anywhere." John nodded, his mind racing. The walls were closing in. They had found the proof. The connection between Miller, the letter, and the danger that had haunted Mr. Harrison for so long. But now, they had to move fast. They couldn't risk Miller discovering that they had uncovered his secrets. As they hurried back out of the house, John's heart pounded in his chest. They had found what they needed, but the danger wasn't over yet. Miller was still out there, and he was likely aware that someone was closing in on him. The chase wasn't over. But one thing was clear. The truth was finally within their grasp. They had the evidence. They had the story. And now, with the help of the authorities, they would bring Frank Miller to justice, no matter the cost. John knew that the journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. The past could finally be put to rest, and Mr. Harrison's life could be free from the shadows that had followed him for so long. But the danger was still lurking, and the truth was just one step away from being fully revealed. Would they catch Miller before it was too late? Time was running out, and every second mattered.